always a pleasure to work with Dr. Miriam Klein-Kasanoff, one of the most distinguished Holocaust educators in this country. And it's a pleasure to be among friends with Dr. Klein-Kasanoff, Avi Mizrahi, Miriam Littman, who do such wonderful organizational work here. And it's always a pleasure to be in a winter in Miami. And Miriam, among the languages in which you welcome people, the one who missed out was Yiddish. Gednuggend. I'm a Galician. That's a real Galician. This is Galicia. Galicia Shalmal is represented in the front row here. My dear friends, the Nazi regime in Germany set out with the aim of exterminating all the Jews of Europe, numbering on their count a little over 11 million, tragically succeeding to the extent of 6 million. At the same time, they set themselves a goal of eradicating a whole culture or way of life. That culture or way of life was represented in the shuls, in the Botei Midrashim, in the yeshivas, in the Hasidic courts, in the educational and other institutions that dotted the length and breadth of Europe. The Nazi era, aided by several decades of communist regimes in so many European countries, together with the ravages of time and the lack of Jewish presence in Europe, a Europe which is so largely Judenrein. These factors and others have coalesced to give tangible expression to an old rabbinic maxim in the form of a rhetorical question. Rotzachto gam yorashto, you have murdered. Do you now also presume to inherit the dead? So many of our cultural treasures have been lost over the last 70 or so years. So few remain. There is a battle going on as we speak at the 11th hour, if not later, to rescue those remnants, to save them for posterity, because it is a truism that for the Jewish people there is no such thing as a separate past, a separate present, and a separate future. The three are intertwined inextricably. The past, the present, and the future meld together for the Jewish people, for the eternal Jewish people. We owe it to our ancestors, we owe it to ourselves, and we owe it to future generations to do what is capable of being done, even at this stage, to rescue those priceless Jewish treasures. We mean the synagogues that are still there, the cemeteries bearing the remains of our ancestors, of our great sages, and so on. Over the years, particularly when I was representative of Agudat Israel World Organization in the United Nations, I had the privilege of being very deeply immersed in the work that is necessary in order to rescue the remnants. I worked at the legal and diplomatic levels, as Miriam Klein-Kasanoff has already foreshadowed. My background is as a specialist in international law. I worked on that level and at the diplomatic level, something which I am proud to say I inherited from my father. My father was, during the war, a diplomat for General Sikorsky's government in exile. And in his capacity in the delegature in Kokand near Tashkent in Uzbekistan, he helped Jews with papers, with visas. He administered humanitarian aid from the United States. And in a small way, he made a major contribution to the health and the well-being and the welfare of the Jews in that region. I am proud to have continued that heritage in my work at the United Nations. During the course of my tenure, we developed approaches which are timeless in character and which resulted in significant achievements being attained. Let me take this opportunity this evening of sketching a number of these approaches and in relating some of the remarkable anecdotes and stories and episodes which accompanied that work. The starting point for us was the starting point that has been the case down through the Jewish generations in implementing a scripture given to us by Yitzchak Avinu, our forefather Isaac, when he benched his son Yaakov. He said to him, HaKoel Koel Yaakov. Yitzchak Avinu couldn't see. He heard the voice of Yaakov, even when he thought it was his son Esau. Our first and greatest commentator on the spot, Rashi, explains what Yitzchak Avinu meant with the words HaKoel Koel Yaakov. The voice is the voice of Yaakov. Shemedaber Beloshon Tachanunim, says Rashi. The way of the Jew is, in the first place, to speak the language of diplomacy, to seek conciliation, to seek resolution of problems by peaceful means. If those means are unsuccessful, there are other approaches in Jewish tradition, but the starting point is HaKoel Koel Yaakov, to speak the language of diplomacy, meaning that our starting point during my tenure was to begin by explaining to people on the other side, representatives of governments, why certain issues are of significance to us, why it is important to us to preserve a Jewish synagogue, why it is important to us to preserve a cemetery, why preservation of a cemetery where our ancestors are interred is something which touches our deepest sensitivities. We have nothing to be ashamed of. On the contrary, we are the bearers and the representatives of a glorious tradition extending over several thousand years, which embodies within it the highest levels of moral and ethical perfection. We are capable of explaining that tradition to those who are prepared to hear. For instance, when we talk about a cemetery, whether it's in Ukraine or in Poland or any other country, we are capable of explaining to the people who are listening to us why that place is sacred territory for us, why it retains its sanctity in perpetuity. At the same time, we are capable of conveying the human dimension, because buried in those cemeteries are walking, talking, thinking, feeling human beings like each and every one of us. People who were fathers and mothers and brothers and sisters and sons and daughters and grandparents. Anyone listening on the other side of the table is capable of relating to that. And we have to do our best to explain in the nicest, most elegant and polished terms what it means to us and why it means that to us. Today also, we live in an era where human rights are considered important, even by those who pay lip service to them, but who desecrate human rights on a daily basis. It's amazing to look at lists of countries that are parties to human rights instruments, to major human rights treaties and conventions, which confer a right of freedom of religion, which confer a right of freedom of education. Freedom of religion extends to allowing the deceased members of a religion to lie in peace without their cemeteries being disturbed and destroyed for whatever the reason is. Even the most hardened communists under the communist era and in the post-communist era are parties to those conventions. They're members of those conventions, and they are bound by them, and we can use that in ways which I will elaborate shortly. Our sages tell us that dvorim hayotzim min halev nichnosim lelev, words that emanate from a heart are bound to penetrate the heart of the listener. And occasionally, we have the privilege of seeing the truth in that wisdom. A number of years ago, a small two-person delegation from Agudath Israel World Organization met with the then Foreign Minister of Ukraine, Gennady Udovenko. My senior partner in this venture was Rabbi Chaskel Besser, a legendary figure in Askonas and in many, many different circles, and I gather from the reaction just now that he's known to a number of people here. A venerable gentleman. We met with the Foreign Minister of Ukraine on Chol Hamoed Sukkos in the elegant conference room of the Ukrainian mission to the United Nations. It was an imposing scene. There on one side were the two representatives of world Jewry. Across the table was a 7-man delegation. It was the most powerful delegation which the Ukrainian government could assemble in New York on that day. In the center was the foreign minister. To the right was the ambassador to the United Nations. To his left was the consul general in New York with several distinguished aides sitting beside them. Towards the end of the meeting, the foreign minister announced that the consul general was going to say a few words, and he handed the floor to the consul general of Ukraine in New York, Krishanevsky. Mr. Krishanevsky spoke with great passion and with great feeling, explaining that it was important for us to focus on the preservation and protection not only of Jewish cemeteries, but of all cemeteries. And of course, we heartily agreed, and with that, the meeting broke up. 2 weeks later, Rabbi Besser was at the Ukrainian consulate, getting a visa to permit him to travel to Kiev. The consul general heard that he was there. He came out, greeted him, and invited him into his office. The walls of the office were bare as the consul general closed the door and invited Rabbi Besser to take a seat. They were bare except for one photo behind the consul general's chair. A young man of about 27. The consul general asked Rabbi Besser, "Do you remember my remarks at our meeting 2 weeks ago?" "Of course," said Rabbi Besser. "You see that young man up there? My only son. 2 years ago, he was killed in a car accident. 4 months ago, vandals broke into the cemetery, destroyed the tombstone on his grave, and desecrated his grave. Dvorim hayotzim min halev nichnosim lelev." Our words penetrated the heart of that consul general because of his own personal history. And he spoke with great passion, with great feeling on that memorable occasion. Another example, in the Slovakian town of Novo Mesto is a famous cemetery, The leading personality there is Reb David Deutsch, Zichrono Livrocha, Talmid Chaver of the Chassam Sofer, Moshe Sofer. The local city council razed that cemetery, destroyed it completely, knocked down all the matzevas on that cemetery and turned it into a park. They even cut down a fruit tree which was right next to Reb David Deutsch's grave and which gave a clear indication of the locus, the site of that grave. On top of that, there were discussions about building a fence around that cemetery. I was involved with those people who were applying to build a fence around the cemetery in order to preserve it as far as possible given the circumstances. In other words, to prevent further desecration on that place. The city